it's now time for us to actually go ahead and test our API. So to test this API, the way I'm going to test this API, I'm not going to use Postman or anything like that. I'm simply going to create to run a REST API test using something that is called JPA unit testing. So to test our API, the first thing that we need to do is I need to add a dependency. So let me just go ahead and open my POM file, right? So under the section of dependency, I need to add a dependency for our JUnit testing. So let me simply go ahead and add a dependency like this. All right. So for the group ID, I'm simply going to name it JUnit, right? Like so. Then for the artifact ID, it's JUnit as well, and for the scope is simply going to be test. So once I've added this dependency, I will simply go ahead and click on import changes so that it will actually CRUD will actually go ahead and download and update my dependency. So after I've done this, I'll simply go ahead under my project, right? Then under this section, I'm simply going ahead and create a file. All right, so there seems to be an error with my JPA. All right, so what I did is I just changed my dependency a little bit. So I had to use the JUnit vintage engine. This is the one that is working for me. So you guys, if you're encountering the same error, just go ahead and change your JUnit dependency to JUnit vintage engine. This one should work pretty fine. So what we want to do is we want to implement our JPA unit testing. So what you have to do is under source, you go to the test folder, then Java, then the package, that package. So under that package, you should actually see that there will be a file called Springboot React.js, depending on the name of your application. That's the file that you're going to find there. So what I did there is I simply created a class called user tests, and in that class I simply pasted a couple of code that we're going to go through. So in this class, for you to implement your JPA unit testing, the first thing that you have to do is you need to annotate your class with data JPA test. So once you annotate your class with data JPA test, you actually need to tell it to tell your Springboot which runner you are going to use. So in this case, I'm going to use Spring Runner. So I will annotate my class with run with. So that is if you are using JUnit version 4. For JUnit version 5, there's no need to annotate with the runner class here, right? So the first thing that you need to do is, you probably have noticed that I've brought in an entity manager. So what an entity manager is actually a Springboot runner that actually allows us to do some data persistence in our table. For example, saving data to our table. Then the next thing that I need to bring in is I need to bring in my user repository. Remember, our user repository is the one that is extending the JPA repository that allows us to perform some transactions to our table. For example, like saving, getting users, and find user by ID, and find all users, all those 4 to 5 methods that are available in the JPA repository. So once you've done that, you guys have to remember that you need to auto wire these two actually instance variables that you have defined. After you have auto wired them, it's now time for you to actually go ahead and create a method, a test function. So the text function that I've created here is, I'm calling it test save user. So this function is the function that is going to be used to save our user. So we want to test our repository, or we want to test our model or our class, whether it's saving a user or not. So I'm going to perform all the transaction in this method. So one thing that you have to note is you need to annotate your method with @test, because when the Spring Runner runs through this class, it will actually look for all methods that are annotated with @tests, and these are the methods that will be run as tests. And also one thing that you have to note here is, for example, if you persist data in a function, once that function ends, the Spring Runner will actually go ahead and tear down the database. So the reason why we have used H2 database, remember we used that volatile database, is the database is really fast in terms of persisting data, etc. And there are no extra configurations that we need to do except for that file I showed you in the application.properties. So now let's quickly go ahead and create our user object. So to create our user, I'm using the default constructor convention to say user is equals to new user. Then I'll set my name, the surname, the email address, the username, and the password. So in this case, I'm simply inputting the strings that I need to save to my user table. So once you have created your object, the next thing that you need to do is you need to persist the user object to your table, or you need to save your user to your database, or to insert the data. If you are talking of MySQL, you need to insert the data into your database. So to insert the data into the database, you use the entity manager. The entity manager allows us to persist data into the database. So what you simply do is you simply bring in the instance entity manager. Then there's a helper function called .persist, and then you simply go ahead and put the user object. So what this line does is it will actually, when the Spring Runner runs throughout the, in this function, it will simply go ahead and save this user into the user table, or into the model that you've defined there. So once you have saved your user, it's now time for us to run our sessions, or it's now time for us to actually go ahead and test whether the whether our entity manager or whether our function has actually persisted the data here. So to do that, you use a function called assertThat, and this function actually comes from the org.assertcore API under the assertions package. So this is where we find this assertThat. So once you type assertThat, for example, it will actually ask you to import the data. So if it doesn't ask you to import data, just remember you actually need to import the assertThat helper function here, like so. So once you have imported the assertThat, so what you want to assert here is we want to assert the data that has been persisted. So what I'm simply doing here is I'm testing if the user that we have persisted is field or a property with value name, that is, for example, John, like this, right? So if this is true, our assertion will pass. So at the same time, I'm simply testing for the email and the username as well. So all these three assertions that I've written here, if one of them fails, then our tests, in this case, our first test, which is test save user, will actually go ahead and fail. But if all these three assertions pass, then we'll move on to the next test. So once we run these three, if they pass, I think we'll actually go ahead and test this once I finished having a rundown with these functions. So once this passes, the next thing that we need to test is we want to test the get user method to say if we have inputted data into a database, are we actually getting all the users from that table? So what I've done is, like I did before, I created a new user object, then I set the username, email, password, and email address, right? And once I've done that, I will simply persist the first user. So the good thing with entity manager is it allows you to do some multiple persistence, right? So at times, if you're using the user repository itself, for example, you could have used the user repository dot save to persist the data, but at times I noticed that at times it won't persist the second data, or there'll be some conflicts, I don't know. But with entity manager, it allows you to do some multiple persistence. So as you can see right now, I'm creating another user called user2. Then with these different values, then I'm persisting that user. So at this point, when our Spring Runner runs, at this point, we're expecting our database to actually have 2 users in its table. So remember, like I said once, for example, once the first test is run, our Spring Runner will actually go ahead and tear down this table, which means each and every function that we write with annotated with a test, it will actually go ahead and start a new test, right? So once I have persisted these 2 user objects, the next thing that I need to do is I actually need to go ahead and find all users. So this is where the user repository comes into play now. So I'm using the user repository to find all users, the OPA function that is provided by the JPA. So I'm finding all users. Once I have found all users, I'm going to store that users into a list. So right now, what I'm simply doing is I'm storing the users in a list of type user, and I'm simply giving it a variable name called users. So which means after Spring Runner has run this command, we now have a list of users in our array. So that is what we have now. So the next thing that I need to do is I now need to run my assertions. So the asset that I'm going to run this time, I'm simply going to say asset that users, the users that we have received, right? Then dot years size of 2. So what I'm simply telling my Spring Runner is this user array or this user object, a list of objects that I've put here, it is going to be of size 2, which means we're expecting this array to have 2 objects, right? And also what I'm actually testing as well is just to confirm is I'm actually going ahead and say contains. So what this contains does is it takes as many arguments as you need. So I'm simply saying, okay, so this array contains 2 objects. So the first object being the user and the second object being the user2. So once this assertion runs and it passes, then our tests will simply go ahead and look for another test. For example, in this case, test get user. So I will run these tests and we'll try to change the values to actually see if it's working. All right. So now let's go ahead and test and actually write a test for get user. So in this particular case, we want to get user for 1 user. So remember on our API, we had defined that at times we might pass a user ID and would want to get that specific user with that specific ID, which would have specified. So again, I'm actually going ahead and create my users. So I've created 3 users here and I've persisted all the users into my table, right? So after I've done that, so I'm simply going ahead and use my user repository again. So I'm simply going ahead and say user repository dot find by ID. So I'm actually going to find a user. So in this case, I'm going to find user3, right? Then I'll simply go ahead and say get ID. So once I say get ID, the ID that would have used to create this user is the ID that will get here in this case. So for example, this was long ID 1, long ID 2, long ID 3. So in this case, we're expecting to have an ID 3, right, in this user.getID. Then I'll simply go ahead and pass the get, which is an optional. So what this does is it will actually return a user object. So I'm simply go ahead and pull this and store them in a variable called person of type user, right? So once I have pulled this, so it actually means at this stage I now have a user object, right, with 1 user. So in this case, I'm expecting to have this user, right? So after I've done that, the next thing that I need to do is I simply need to go ahead and write my assertions. So the first assertion that I'm going to write is I'm going to say, okay, for this person, can you actually go ahead and get the name of that person, right? So once you've got the name of that person, I'm going to say is equal to. So which means whatever that I have here, I'm saying it is equal to, then I'm simply go ahead and use our hard-coded user here, user3 dot get name. So remember we had set the name here. So if I say dot get name, I'm expecting to have Mary here, right? So if these two matches, so this assertion will pass. So the next assertion that I'm going to write is I'm simply going to write an assertion of saying, okay, for this person again, can you actually go ahead and get the surname, right? Then if you get the surname, then I'm saying, okay, this surname, I said that this surname is equal to the surname of this user 3 was Jane, but in this case, I've written Jane's, right? So which means I know that it's going to fail. So this is one of the things that we want to test. So initially these are the three that I've prepared so far. So let's just quickly go ahead and run our class. So to run our class, you simply go ahead and say Marvin clean, then test, like so. So once you have done that, your Spring will start by scanning the projects and creating the snapshot of the project, and it will actually go ahead and initialize our Spring Runner, initialize our entity manager, then actually go ahead and start our H2 database and stuff like that. So right now it's saying tests, which means Spring has realized that we want to run some tests. So it will start the H2 database, it will run the tests, tearing down, and run the other tests, and so forth. So let's wait. Let's give it a moment, right? Right. So right now it has finished to write our tests. So in this case, right, if you go to the statistics here, it's saying the build has failed. So the reason why the build has failed, remember, we had put a wrong surname here. So let's just go ahead and confirm if this is if this is where the error is coming from. So right now it's saying we have ran 3 tests. So remember, we have 3 methods. We have 1, 2, 3. This one. So we have 3 functions that we are running. So it's saying it has run 3 tests. Then out of these 3 tests, 1 is failed, right? So if we scroll up, it will actually goes ahead and tell you where the fail is. So right now it's saying under user tests for the function test.getUser. So this was the last function that we wrote, test get user, right? It's expecting to have Jane, right, on this assertion. It's expecting to have Jane, but we have written Jane's, right? So this was a purposeful thing that we did here so that we can actually see if our tests are running. So if I actually go ahead and correct it to Jane, right? Because here for the surname we had set it to Jane, not Jane's. So if I go ahead and set it to Jane and rerun our tests, we're expecting our tests to pass, all the 3 tests that we've done here to pass, right? So while this is running, let's just go ahead and change let's say one last thing just to confirm, just to make sure that our test is working. So I'll simply go ahead and update our email, right, for the first test, right? So I put 34, right, on the email. So I'm expecting this first test to fail because the email is no longer is no longer a value that is expected from our user, because the email that is there is john@gmail.com. So here I've say jo34@gmail, right? So our test is finished. So as you can see, it's now saying build success, and it is ran 3 tests and there's 0 failures, 0 errors, and the script 0. So it means our test has failed. So let's simply go ahead and rerun that test again because I've updated the email address. right. Right, so our testing is finishing. What's going on with the dog outside? All right, sorry about that, guys. Okay, so it's saying the build has failed. So if you scroll up, it's saying it's expecting we have written jword34@gmail and it's expecting Jan. So it means where we have updated our email, this is where our fail, this is where the test is failing. So I'll just revert it back. So you guys, you can actually go ahead and play around with the remaining one test to actually go ahead and do that. So the next thing, so right now I think let's just go together with the last two tests. So the last two tests is I want to test if it's if it's updating, right? So tests, so I'll simply go ahead and say tests, test update user, like so, right? So remember, we need to annotate this function with test, right? Because remember, we have on our API we have an update endpoint. So what I'm simply going to do is I'm simply going to copy these two, right? And paste here, right? So this is the user that we have persisted. Then I'm simply going to say this is no longer user 2, this is now the new user, right? So for the new user, what I actually need to do is I need to say, okay, for the new data that is coming, right, can you actually go ahead and update the first user with this new data? So the way I'm going to do that is I'm simply going ahead and update this, right? Right, so this is the new user and I'm not going to persist this, right? So this is the new user object. So what we want to do is I want to find my user by this ID. So what I'm simply going to do is I'm simply going to say user repository, right? So remember we are saying user repository dot find by ID. So I want to actually go ahead and pull the first user. So I'm going to say user, which is the first user, dot get ID, then dot get, like so. All right, so I'll simply extract this to a variable, right? So this is now let's say old user, right? So let's update our old user data with this new set of user data. So let's simply go ahead and grab our old user. So we'll say old user dot set. So we want to set the name, set name, then we'll set it with the new user details dot get name. So what this does is it simply update the old user data with the new user data that we've passed here. So let's simply go ahead and copy this and we'll paste it a couple of times. Then we'll do the same for surname. So we need to set the surname and update it with the new surname. So let's do this for the email address and we'll update it with the new email. So same as for the username, we'll do the same for the username. We'll get the username of the new data and we'll simply do it for the password as well, and we'll simply get the password for the new data, right? So after we have done this, the next thing that we need to do is we need to save these details, or need to persist this new data that we have for this user object. So to do that, we'll simply go ahead and say old user, or we'll simply say entity manager dot persist, then we'll say old user. So what this does is it actually goes ahead and persist the old user and persist the updated changes that we've done to the old user object, right? So once you have persisted the data, the next thing that you probably need to do is to actually go ahead and get the data. Then once you get the data, we now need to write some assertions like what we did here to actually test if the new data is this one. So to do that, let's simply go ahead and say user repository, right? So we say user repository dot find by ID, and we'll simply pass user, the first object that we had, dot get ID. Then we'll simply say dot get, right? So once we have got this, the next thing that we need to do is to create a variable out of this. So we'll simply say this is now the updated user, right? So we are simply getting the updated user information when we're getting it by the ID. We are finding the information by the ID. So this retrieves the above new updated user information. So what you need to do is you now need to write the assertions like we did here. So let me just simply go ahead and copy these assertions, because these are the same assertions that we need to do here. So for the new assertions, we are simply going to say, okay, so for the updated user, can you simply go ahead and get the name for the updated user? And we're simply saying, so this updated user is now equal to, right, the new user information that we passed here. So I'll simply say new user dot get name like this. Then I'll simply do the same for the surname. So we are getting the surname, then is equal to the surname. So I can say new user dot get surname, or I can simply go ahead and copy the surname here and paste it here. So these are the assertions that we need. So once you're done with the assertions, you can actually go ahead and assert the email, password, username. The rest of the fields, it's actually recommended to do it that way so that you can actually go ahead and test all your fields. But for now, these two suffice. So after we've done that, the next thing that we need to do is to run our test, right? So once it's running our test, we are now expecting that these two assertions will pass, just because we have updated the old user information with this new user that we have set here, and we've persisted the new changes. So we are no longer expecting our table to be having this old data, but we're now expecting it to have this new data that we have here. So for our sessions, like for example, for this surname, which is more descriptive, we are getting the surname, and we are saying for the surname that we're getting, it's supposed to be equal to Gordon here. So which means it's simply going to get the Gordon surname. All right, so our test is finished. So as you can see, the build was success, and it has run 4 tests, and they were all successful. So the next, the last method that we probably need to do here is the delete method. So for the delete method, what I'll simply do is I'm simply going to call it. So let's just go ahead and implement it. So I'll simply say public void test delete users, because remember our API has a functionality of deleting users. So I'll annotate this function with test so that our test runner, our Spring runner, will actually go ahead and run our method. So once you have done this, the next thing that you need to do is let's simply go ahead and copy and paste these two user objects, right? So once I've copied and pasted, I'm persisting these two user objects, right? Then once I've persisted them, for the second one, I need to persist it as well this time. So I'll simply persist the new user object like so, right? So once we have persisted the new user, the user's objects that we have here, the next thing that we need to do is we simply need to find all users. So right now, before I delete, I want to run assertions just to make sure that we have 2 users here. So the first assertion that I'm going to write, and first of all, I need to get, I need to find all the users, right? So I'll simply go ahead and say find all, right? So under find all, I will simply pull this to make a variable. Then I'll say users, like so. So once I've got all the users, this is now a list that has users. I'll simply say go ahead and say assert that users, the new users objects that I have here, right? I'm simply going to say it has the size of 2, because remember we've persisted 2 objects here, user and the new user, and those 2 users and that new user, this user object is going to have the user object and the new user object. So this is the assertion that I'm still going ahead and write. So this is just to make sure, just to confirm that we've persisted these 2 changes. So the next thing that I need to do is I now need to delete all these transaction in my table. So I'll simply go ahead and use user repository dot, there's a delete all method. So what this method does is it actually go ahead and transact and delete all the details in my table. So once I've deleted all the table, the last thing that I need to do is I actually need to go ahead and write my assertion here. So the assertion that I'm going to write, I'm simply going to say assert, right? Assert that. Then I'll say user repository, right? Dot, I'm simply going to say find all, right? So if I write find all, I'm expecting it to return an empty list because this is empty. So I will simply say dot is empty, like so. So this is what I'm expecting on my session. I'm expecting to get an empty list because we have deleted all the transactions that we have saved here. So after that, let's just quickly go ahead and run our test. So I'll simply say Marvin test like this, right? So once this test runs, just for a recap, we are actually creating a new user and we're persisting the data. That's user number 1. We are creating another user called new user and we're persisting the data to our table. That's user number 2, right? So once I've done that, I will simply fetch all the users, select all from user table, then I will get everything, right? And I'll store it in a list of users. So in my list, I will actually have 2 objects, right? So I'm going to run an assertion to say, okay, assert that this users object that we've got is of size 2, right? And if it's of size 2 and it's actually going to contain new user and the user object, right? So once this passes, we'll actually go ahead and delete everything in our transaction. Once we have deleted everything, then we're simply going to say find all, select all from our table. Then we are expecting that our table is supposed to be empty. So the test has finished. So we can actually see that we've now ran 5 tests and we have no failures. So that was it, guys, in terms of assertions. This is how you can actually go ahead and write your assertions unit test for your JPA repository. So this was it, guys. So in the next section, we now want to look at how you can actually go ahead and integrate your React.js application with your Springboot RESTful API. So see you in the next one.